is a, an issue that I've been meaning to make a video about. There's a very popular gardening video out there called the Back to Eden gardening film. And the key protagonist in that film is a documentary, and you've got this guy, Paul Gauci, with an amazing garden. Everything looks great. He's telling you what he did to have his garden, and he's telling you what to do to have a great garden. And he just says, just cover everything with the mulch, and everything's going to be great. And I'm sure eventually that's the case. And of course, this guy's in like zone 9 or zone 8, right? Not where basically things, if you have a mulch on a soil, it can continue breaking down in the winter. Right. Here where I live, nothing's breaking down in the winter. Everything's just in suspended animation sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
So I've told people, if I was establishing a garden, you got nothing there, right? Especially if it was like that builder's loam, that clay and rock, it's just nothing there. It's basically been wrecked, right? It's been dumped off a dump truck, and it's been used because you can pack it down and it won't move after a giant tank bulldozer thing's driven over it. It really aggregates and holds in place. I would say throw a bunch of manure in it, till the whole thing. And then people are shocked because I'm a no-till gardener. I never till my garden. I'm talking about year one, step one. Because sure, you could mulch that and leave a mulch on it, and over time the worms and stuff will work it through, and eventually, but it could take years for that to happen. Whereas, the main thing is you want to get some of that OM, organic matter, into the soil. And so, yeah, sure, till it in the first year. You're going to take years off of that process, then be a purist, But
well, what I agree with you, and I tell people is the first year, if you have crappy soil, you might as well till it, because see, the reason we're no-till gardeners is that we know tilling can harm the soil. But if you're starting with crap,
it's already wrecked.
You're not going to harm it. No. Right? It can only go up from there. So the first year tilling it and getting organic matter in there is critical. There are people who are very strong proponents of using wood chips, and I am too. And they'll tell you things like, oh, you put wood chips on there, 2 years later, you've got this great soil. That's baloney. I
agree.
I have clay soil, but it's pretty good. And I've been here 15 years, and I can dig down, in the top 3 or 4 inches is actually pretty good in my perennial garden now. But if I dig below that, it's just as crappy as it was 15 years ago, because I'm not digging in that soil. See, the vegetable garden's a little different because it tends to get, moved around a little more. You're doing a little more digging and harvesting every year and so on. But in gardens where it's just sitting, putting mulch on top, it works, but it's a really slow process. And I don't know how people say in 2 years you're going to see a big change. It's not going to happen. Now, 2 years later, yeah, it's better than it was when you started, but you got a long way to go.
Yeah, maybe after 2 years, you've got a centimeter of black, compost between the mulch layer and the clay layer. And to some extent, the clay is holding on to some of the nutrients that are resulting from that breaking down.
Yeah.
But
I still believe in the wood chips, but I think the advantage for improving soil is highly overrated by some people.
Yeah, it's good for maintaining. If you have good soil, especially in a perennial garden where you're not, with potatoes and stuff, like I've grown potatoes in wood chip mulch gardens, and you don't want to work them wood chips into the garden. So when you got to harvest the potatoes, you got to move the wood chips aside, get the potatoes out, then put the wood chips back, because you don't want to be working all these wood chips into the soil, because then you're probably going to have a nitrogen drop for a year or two while the organisms work that all out. But getting way off topic here. but it's all good, it's all the stuff that you think about when you think about soil, because hey, this guy said this guy said that. What's the truth, right? Also, I think to some extent your climate matters too. If everything's frozen solid.
Yeah, you and I are in basically the same climates, and 6 months of the year is a write-off as far as
ice
things decomposing, right?
Yeah.
It's frozen solid. So sure, in a warm climate, I'm sure it goes much faster.
I think wood chips are a better, like in terms of like building soil, I think they're probably work better in a hotter place.
Mhm.
I think there's probably also advantages in a hotter place. They probably regulate the soil temperature better in the summer.
Yeah.
Whereas here in Canada, like you want to have like I like to use hay and grass. I like to use like fast breaking down stuff
Yeah.
just to get some heat happening because I need anything to get some heat happen, especially this time of year where it's below freezing every night or almost every night. It's still we all have the odd warm day, but it was I don't know, it was snowing a couple of days ago. It's still
Yeah.
cold, right? So we'll do just to get the spring going. We'll do anything to get some kind of heat happening.
Yeah.
Um, all right. Next question. I guess this flows from the last question to some extent. Um, what are aggregate? This is a term I hadn't heard before, so
Mm.
um, so it got me thinking. What are aggregates and what are binding agents in soil?
Yeah. So aggregates is one of those terms that the soil people know really well, but for some reason gardeners never use the word. Right? We talk about fluffy soil and black soil but we don't call them aggregates. And I like the term aggregates because I think it kind of describes what happens. So as soil gets better, the small pieces of soil, the sand and silt and clay, they start clumping together into larger and larger particles. And I recommend that all gardeners go for a walk in the woods. Like it doesn't have to be woods. It could be like a prairie meadow that's been there forever, but find some place that hasn't been disturbed for 30 years. Go for a walk and dig around in the soil. Right? In a wooded area, you can probably do that with your hand. You don't even need a trowel. And just feel the difference between that soil and what you have back in your garden. And I have a natural wooded area. It's a sugar bush. And that soil is crumbly and there's these larger particles in there. And I can almost dig it with my hand.
Yep.
That's aggregation. So what happens is that these small particles, along with some organic matter and humus and some binding agents, all come together and they make these big clumps.
When you say clump, what like
Well,
what size of thing are you talking about?
well, they can be as large enough to sit in your palm of your hand.
Right.
So if you go into good soil and you sort of dig around, you can actually take a good clump of soil and you'll see all the pieces in there. You'll see roots in there and old plant matter and so on. But most of the time they're smaller. They're sort of a couple millimeters across, right? But they're visible to the eye. Whereas, things like silt and clay particles are not visible to the eye. So we do want them larger. And as they get larger, what happens is that we have these large pieces, and now there's lots of air spaces between them. Okay, and that's really the secret. As long as our soil has small particles, they gather together and there's very little air in there. As you get aggregation, you get more and more air because you've got these big pieces. And remember, 25% of good soil is air, so it's got to stay somewhere. The other thing that happens is that roots are not very good at drilling into small pores. They need pretty big pores. In fact, one of the things they do is if a dew worm makes a channel somewhere, the roots will actually follow that channel because it's the easiest place to grow. And as we get these aggregates, the particles are big. So these particles are bigger than a grain of sand, right? And now the roots have an easy time going between the aggregates. So suddenly roots have no problem growing and finding lots of air in this soil.
All right.
But the opposite is no aggregates and compacted soil. And in that we have no air, we have no spaces for the roots to grow, and things just don't live in there. Even microbes have trouble living in compacted soil.
Mm.
So as these aggregates develop, we're in effect creating the perfect place for microbes to grow and for plant roots to grow.
Right.
So the whole process of building soil is to increase the amount of aggregation you have.
Okay.
And one of the things in the you haven't probably gotten to this part in the book, but in the second section of the book, it talks about tests that you can do to evaluate your soil. And one of them is aggregate stability. So what you do is you take one of these aggregates and you put it in a little mesh piece of metal, like a chicken wire thing, and you settle it in water and see what happens. Good aggregation will sit there. It doesn't fall apart. Bad aggregation, it just crumbles and falls through.
Right, right, right.
But good aggregation, all these things are clumped together fairly strongly, and the water forces that are rushing in there can't break them apart. So it's a very, I can't say it's very stable, but it's fairly stable in the soil.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And you can actually measure it yourself by doing that aggregation test to see how stable your aggregates are. But it's all about aggregation. So making healthy soil is all about making aggregation. So you have to ask the question, well, what makes aggregation? Right? Well, it's microbe poop. It's microbe juice. It's worm juice. It's all the excrements that these things are giving off that stick this together. And some of the things they give off last a fair amount of time. So they're kind of a glue. It's an organic glue that they're giving off. And if all the life died, that glue would stick around for a while, but over time, that glue slowly decomposes and degrades and you lose the aggregation.
Right.
So what it means is you constantly have to keep the life in the soil to re-aggregate, I guess, to keep making more of this sticky stuff, right?
Right.
So again, it's that life in the soil that makes the sticky stuff, that makes your aggregation, and the aggregates is what plants love to grow in. Right?
And it really is an extraordinary example of a symbiosis, just even in terms of the relationship between the organisms and the soil. If in order for the soil to be an ideal environment for them, they need to be doing their thing to maintain the bind, to provide the binding agents that allow the aggregation, that allows the soil to do what soil does to support the life that grows and to keep the whole thing going.
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote the book, it wasn't as clear to me when I started as when I finished. But it's amazing how all this kind of comes together and how all these organisms influence the other organisms and make their life easier. But it's very cyclical, right?
Yes.
It all comes back down to helping themselves. And in the process, plants can live because plants can't do much on their own. They're not as good as some of these other things to condition that soil. So they're kind of waiting for these other things to condition the soil for them so that they can grow. Right.
Well, yeah, and it speaks to, I mean, this was, probably I'm going to mention it now because I'm going to forget about it as we go along. But I mean, it seems to me a lot about having healthy soil and a successful, relatively low maintenance garden is to mimic natural systems as much as possible. Because a garden is not a natural system, at least in terms of annuals, right? It's not like a forest where there's leaves falling down. It's remulching itself every year automatically. The one thing it's missing from your garden is that it's artificial in the sense that if you don't provide the fuel for that system, some minimal amount of mulch to keep the soil covered to feed the soil life, it's just not going to get what it needs. So that's your main, aside from, I guess, giving it water if it needs it and that sort of thing. One of your main responsibilities as a gardener is to fill in the gaps that are, because you have a slightly artificial situation. You've got tomatoes growing in Canada. You're making a tomato forest, you're making a carrot forest, you're making these things aren't natural. These things don't exist. I don't think they exist naturally in nature like that. So you're solving problems that are the result of your sort of artificial growing system by, bringing in something. And in the case of my garden, that would be mulches.
Yeah. Well, if we think about a natural system, right, that soil is completely covered with weeds in effect, right? Whereas in our gardens, we have that tomato in the middle and we get rid of all the weeds. So the amount of plant growth is largely reduced. And those roots, as they die, are adding organic matter to the soil, right? So we're missing that. And you're right. That's why we have to bring a bit back every year to kind of replace what we're destroying. But the key is to understand the natural system and then figure out, well, how can we do the least amount of work to make this other system, our garden, actually function, right?
Yes.
And the more we mimic nature, the easier it becomes. We got to let nature do all of this stuff. That's why I'm not a big fan of the way we started this program, right? Go out and buy bags of soil and pop them in a box and we got a garden. I'm sure if you buy the right soil that works, but you've sort of short-circuited the whole process. And if you don't understand the soil and what you did, you're going to have problems down the road because you're not making that better and better every year.
That's right. Well, and you've missed the opportunity to learn about it. It's almost like buying a musical album and thinking you're a musician.
Yeah.
Buying an album, thinking, "Hey, I'm a great musician because I can press play and this thing sounds great." It's like, no, you haven't learned anything about music, right?